signals from space, intelligent signals from space, search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They haven't found any. I don't think they will. But there are lots of radio signals in space. The sun gives off radio. Sounds like static. I've listened to it. It's not enjoyable, but you know. There are pulsars that give off radio signals, and it's like a pip, 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 just a repeated string. With all these natural radio signals, how can these astronomers distinguish a signal that comes from an intelligent alien species from all these natural signals? And the answer is a signal from an alien intelligence would have information in it. Isn't that interesting? The whole program is predicated on that. And yet those same scientists, when they look through the microscope, you know, they look at DNA, all that, there's no intelligence there. That just happened. Inconsistent. What about geology? So let's talk a little about rocks and the fossils within them. And the first thing we have to deal with is this little myth that rocks are hundreds of millions of years old. And we've been taught that. We've been taught that radiometric dating proves that. So I want to talk a little bit about that process, radiometric dating, how it works. There are certain atoms, we're all made of atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons circling around there. And most atoms are what we call stable, meaning they'll remain the same kind of atom forever. But there are a small number of atoms that are radioactive or unstable. And what that means is they will spontaneously change into another type of atom. You don't have to do anything, they do it on their own. For example, uranium-238 is unstable, it's radioactive. It'll sit there for a while being perfectly happy, uranium-238, and then poof, it'll eject a helium nucleus and turn into thorium. It just happens for certain atoms, particularly some of the heavier elements. And thorium is also radioactive or unstable, and so it'll sit there for a little while, and then poof, one of the neutrons will eject an electron and become a proton, and so it changes into this next atom, which changes to the next, all the way down to lead-206. Now, lead-206 is stable, so once it hits there, lead-206 will stay lead-206 forever. It's not radioactive. And this process takes time. Now, for any given atom, we don't know when it's going to pop and change into the next one, but you have a large sample of them. Statistically, you know that after a certain period of time, a certain fraction of them will have changed. It's kind of like a popcorn. When you're popping the popcorn, you don't know which kernel's going to pop next, right? It could be that one, and then that one, and then that one. But you do know that after about 2 minutes, you're done. If they're going to pop, they've popped. It's the same way with this. We don't know when any individual atom is going to change, but we do know that statistically, after a certain amount of time, so many of them will have changed. And for uranium to go down to lead, statistically, it takes a very long time for a significant fraction of that uranium to change to lead, because we know over the course of measuring it that just a little bit changes in a year. And so for like half of it to change all the way to lead, it would take theoretically billions of years. And so the idea is you can use this like a clock, because we find rocks that have uranium in them, including uranium-238. And so the idea, but they also have lead in them. And so the idea is if you had a chunk of solid uranium and you waited for a while, eventually it would be part uranium, part lead, part intermediate elements too, and then eventually it'd be all lead. That just naturally happens. And it theoretically would take billions of years for uranium to completely become lead. And so the idea is you find a rock that's got some uranium, some lead in it, and you use that, knowing the rate at which the uranium changes, and you figure out when it was all uranium, if it was all uranium. How do you know it didn't start with some lead? That's the thing we need to remember. You see, you can think of the lead or the uranium turning into lead like sand going through an hourglass. Uranium's the top chamber, the lead's the bottom chamber. One naturally flows into the other, okay? And if you came in here and I had an hourglass and it was halfway through, I said, how long ago do you think I turned that over? He said, well, that's easy, Dr. Lau. It's an hourglass, about halfway through. I'd say about a half an hour. I said, I gotcha. I turned it over only 1 minute ago, but already a lot of the sand was in the bottom chamber. You see, you can't assume that all the sand is in the top chamber to begin with. And by the same token, you can't assume the rock was 100% uranium to begin with. It might have had some lead in it to begin with. And by the way, secularists do not assume that the rock was pure uranium when it started. They assume it had some lead in it. How much lead did it start with? You tell me how old you want the rock to be, I'll tell you how much lead it started with. You see, there's an issue there. And they're aware of that, and they've got ways to try and deal with that. I'm not trying to sell them short. But there are assumptions that are made when you assume that just because half the sand's in the bottom chamber, it's a half an hour. How do you know somebody wasn't adding sand when you weren't looking? Uranium is leachable in salt water. It can move in and out of a rock. It's not a closed system. How do you know the throat of the bottle has always been the same size? That's probably a pretty good assumption for an hourglass. We can't imagine how that could be too much different. But we don't know that the rate at which uranium changes into lead has always been what it is today. It might have been different in the past. In fact, there's good evidence that it was. And so my point is that all these radiometric dating methods, they all rely on assumptions about the initial conditions, how much uranium and lead there was to begin with. They assume that the decay rate is constant. We now have very compelling evidence that it's not, and that the system is closed, and in most cases it isn't. And so that's why you get all kinds of rather crazy results when you do these things. And by the way, we've dated rocks from Mount St. Helens, and radiometric dating is supposed to tell you when the rock hardened. That sets the 0 point on the clock, okay? And so these are brand new rocks. Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. There were some follow-up eruptions. We took rocks that were brand new from that eruption and sent them in and had them radiometrically dated, which would normally be a ridiculous thing to do because it's expensive, and we know when these rocks form because we saw them form. But we wanted to know if the method was reliable. And you know, they came back with estimated ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years on rocks that are brand new. You say, that's an isolated incident. It's not. If you go to Hawaii and take a rock from Hawaii, send it in and have it dated, you'll get millions of years, very consistently. So radiometric dating has been demonstrated to not work on rocks of known age, and yet secularists assume it works on rocks of unknown age. Now, I don't think that's very scientific. What about carbon dating? Similar process, but with carbon dating, the time scale is much shorter. Most carbon is C12 because it's got 6 protons and 6 neutrons in the nucleus. There's a variety of carbon called C14. It's produced in the upper atmosphere as cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms, convert them into C14, and then C14 will gradually decay back into nitrogen. It has a half-life of 5,700 years. So if you have a chunk of solid C14, you wait 5,700 years, half of it will have decayed into nitrogen. Now, you all have a little bit of C14 in you because you see, we breathe that air. The plants take in the carbon dioxide in the air, and a small fraction of that, 1 atom in a trillion, is C14. And then the animals eat the plants, or we eat the plants, or we eat the animals that ate the plants. Either way, you're getting that C14 in you. So all of you have a little C14 in you. You're all just a little bit unstable. How about that? Now, when an organism is alive, that C14 is decaying back into nitrogen, but you're eating new food and you're replacing it. So the C14 to C12 ratio in you is about the same as is in the external environment until you die. But when you die, you're not eating, you're not breathing, you're not taking in any new C14, and so the C14 simply decays away. And so, while you're living, the C14 remains constant until you die, and then it decays down. And so the idea with carbon dating is you can use it to tell how long ago something died. And it's neat, it's a clever idea. And the interesting thing is it tends to give answers that are pretty consistent with the biblical timescale. Now, it's based on assumptions too, but with carbon dating, when we test it on things of known age, it tends to give sensible answers. It tends to give the right answer. Not always, not 100% of the time, but often. And the interesting thing is we've even tested it on things like diamonds. Diamonds, in the evolutionists' view, are supposed to be 1 to 2 billion years old. But you know what? We found C14 in them. C14, the half-life's 5,700 years. In fact, if the entire Earth were nothing but C14, after 1 million years, you'd not have 1 atom of it left. It decays too quickly. And yet we find it in diamonds that are supposed to be billions of years old. They can't be anywhere close to that. This demonstrates that these diamonds are much, much younger. They're thousands of years old. It's consistent with the biblical time scale because the Bible's clear that God created in 6 days, and that was a few thousand years ago. The Earth's not billions of years old, as we've been taught, as we've been led to believe. And there are hundreds of physical processes that limit the age of the Earth to much less than the secular time scale. And we see the secularists need the billions of years to make evolution sound plausible. Not that it really would be anyway, but they need that. But you look at the evidence, and it's consistent with a much younger time scale. One example, the rate at which salt flows into the ocean. Even fresh water has a little bit of salt in it. It picks it up from the continents, dumps it into the ocean. The water evaporates, but it leaves the salt. And so the oceans are getting saltier and saltier every year by a little bit. You have 450 million tons of salt that's pumped into the ocean every year and doesn't leave. So the salinity of the oceans has gone up since creation. You can get rid of a little bit of the salt with salt sprays and stuff like that, but only 27% maximum. And if you do the math and you figure out how long ago could the oceans have existed, maximum age of 62 million years. And it sounds like a lot, but that's assuming the ocean started as freshwater, which we don't think they did. If they started as saltwater, they'd be much younger than 62 million years. But in the secular view, oceans are supposed to be 3 billion years old. So you see, it's a problem because the evidence indicates they can't be more than 62 million years old. And so that's consistent with the biblical time scale, because 6,000 is less than 62 million, but 3 billion isn't. The rate at which mud accumulates on the ocean floor. You have about 20 billion tons of mud accumulating on the ocean floor every year. It builds up. You can get rid of a little bit with plate subduction, tectonics, but the rest of it just builds up. How long does it take to get the current amount of mud on the ocean floor? Less than 12 million years. And that's assuming there was no worldwide flood, which would dump a lot of mud on the ocean floor very quickly, obviously. So again, that limits the age to much less than 12 million years. Now, creation's consistent with that. Creation, about 6,000 years for the age of the earth. Secular view, about 3 billion years. Not consistent with, the data is not consistent with the secular worldview. Human population. I just recently redid this calculation just to check it, but human population, there's no way human beings go back, 100,000 years as the secularists like to think. We have records, at least estimates of world population over time. We can do the math on that. Human beings go back to it fits in with the biblical time scale of about 6,000 years. It's wildly inconsistent with the secular time scale, where you try to push it back to 30,000 or 100,000 or even a million years. It's unrealistic. But the best evidence for the age of the earth is that we have the record, we have the birth certificate of the universe. God tells us he made in 6 days. It's clear from context, those are ordinary earth rotations, each one bound by an evening and a morning. It's the basis for our work week, according to Exodus 20:11. That's the best evidence. See, the secularists like to come along and say, the earth's billions of years old, take my word for it. But God says, I created in 6 days, take my word for it. And he was the only one who was there. So, if you think about it. What about these fossils that we find? And we do find fossils all over the world. Here's a fossil ichthyosaur. This is a marine reptile, thought to be extinct today. At least we haven't found any living. I always had the impression that fossils took millions of years to form. Well, this organism, whatever happened to him happened quickly, or actually it's a her, because she's giving birth. You see the baby ichthyosaur being born there? They're born tail first because they're air breathers. God thought about that. They're not born like other creatures where the head comes out first, the tail comes out first, because as soon as they're born, they have to swim to the surface and get their first breath of air. That's a neat design feature. Wonder how long evolution took to figure that out. Needed to turn it around. No, that's not going to work. Not going to work. In the lower section there's a fish that's buried in the process of eating another fish. Now, I don't think that took millions of years. Whatever happened to them happened quickly. I mean, the ichthyosaur was killed, buried in the process of giving birth. It's fossilized now. See, people think that things die and then they slowly become a fossil over millions of years. Most things don't become a fossil at all. And let's do a little thought experiment here. And I've been picking on dogs, we'll pick on cats now. So let's do an experiment on our dead cat, Earl. We're going to watch him slowly fossilize over millions of years, right? So don't touch, leave it alone here. We want to wait a little while. Well, what you end up with day 3 is a very smelly dead cat on the grass. And on day 9, you end up with a very smelly dead cat on the grass. And on day 20, parts of Earl are missing. And on day 38, more of Earl is missing. And on day 65, Earl's missing. And you know that because we've seen animals that have been killed and left on the side of the road. They don't just gradually turn into statues. That's not what happens. They're gone after a while. They get picked off by other animals, scavengers. They decay, they're recycled back into the environment. You see, in order to get a fossil, you have to bury something. And even then, I was given the wrong idea that, the fish dies, it sinks down to the bottom, and then, and it's slowly over millions of years covered with sediment, one layer after the next. No, wait a minute. If it took millions of years for the sediment to be deposited, then why didn't the fish decay? Right? You have to bury something rapidly to get it to fossilize. I mean, if it's just partly buried for millions of years, the top part would decay, it'd be picked off by scavengers. Most fish float when they die anyway. So that's not going to work. That's not how you form a fossil fish. If you really want to form a fossil fish, here's how you do it. You go home to your aquarium, and you dump some concrete in there. This is still legal in Colorado. I'm not sure about here. That's going to bury him. It's going to kill him. It's going to bury him immediately. Usually there's enough bacteria left that they have the ability to eat away at the soft tissue of the fish because it's dead now. But the bone's permineralized. The minerals move in and fill in the holes in the bone. That's what a fossil is. It's a stone that looks like a bone because it's been permineralized. And that's how you form a fossil. It doesn't take millions of years. We can do it in a laboratory in days. It doesn't take long. It just takes the right conditions. It takes flood conditions to do that. What about the kinds of fossils that we find? Do they illustrate evolution? Because you'll see pictures in textbooks, the evolution of the horse. And, of course, we have no idea they have the stripes on and everything. We don't know what the skin looked like, but we do know what the bones looked like. And that looks pretty convincing. You got that little horse evolving into a big one, but wait a minute. These are horses of different sizes, aren't they? And, well, the foot structure's a little different for a couple of them. Okay, but that's variation within a kind. What you have here are different varieties of horse. You say, well, they're different sizes. That's okay. We have horses today that are different sizes. These are both adult horses. They're just different breeds, you see. And so that's not a problem. We have lots of different varieties of horse today. We should expect to find some in the fossil record that have gone extinct because their variety wasn't conducive to survival in their environment. And yes, some in the past had different. They didn't have the single toe. It was divided into three or whatever. That's fine. They're still horses. What you don't find is a non-horse changing into a horse, and that's very consistent throughout the fossil record. There will always be a handful of disputed specimens. We'll say, hey, we think we found the transition between this and that. But generally, the transitions are from one variety within a kind to another variety in the same kind, something that's perfectly consistent with biblical creation. But don't rocks take millions of years to form? Here's a set of car keys embedded inside solid rock. I don't think that took millions of years to form. Here's a man-made clock embedded inside solid rock. Did that take millions of years to form? I don't think so. What about these rock layers? I mean, look, there's a person down there at the bottom for scale. Surely those took millions of years to be deposited, right? No, those did not exist before 1980, those sediment layers. Not all of them are rock, some of them are loose, but some of them are solid rock. And those were produced in the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980. They didn't exist before then. And another eruption came through and sloshed a wave in Spirit Lake and cut through those layers and formed a canyon 1/40th the scale of a Grand Canyon in days, maybe hours. It doesn't take millions of years. See, they used to teach these fine laminations that you find in the Grand Canyon, that those are annual. One was laid down and then the next year another was laid down, and you add them up, it's millions of layers and therefore millions of years. Except this isn't from the Grand Canyon. This is from the Mount St. Helens eruption. Those layers were all laid down simultaneously in a matter of hours. Okay, so it doesn't take millions of years. And those are the same kind of laminations you find in the Tepete sandstone, which covers it's found in the Grand Canyon and much of the United States and Canada. It's given different names in different parts of the world, but that's continuous. So whatever deposited those layers was covering the continent. A worldwide flood would do that. We find trees in rocks that are buried vertically, and a lot of them are missing roots. They tend to have a little bit of coal down at the bottom sometimes. I was taught that coal forms over millions of years as peat accumulates in swamps, except we sometimes find impressions of leaves in the coal, so we know what kind of plants were around there. And they're not the plants that are found in swamps. They're the plants that are found in mountain rainforests. So we've been lied to about coal formation. It can happen very quickly. And these trees often don't have roots, which is strange because most trees I know have roots, right? But we now know how that happens because when Mount St. Helens erupted, it did it. The eruption uprooted trees, that's why they don't have roots, and they tended to float in Spirit Lake. They tended to float vertically because of the little remnant of the root that's left in most cases, and then eventually they get waterlogged and sink down, and then sediment would come and cover them up. It doesn't take millions of years. This happened recently. We know how it happens now. So you see, when we take a look at the rock layers and we do good observational science, observing things like Mount St. Helens, we say, oh, that's consistent with a recent creation and a global flood. It's not consistent with millions of years of slow, gradual processes. You see, the rocks are not a record of millions of years. The rocks are a record of the worldwide flood, most of them. Now, there are some that happened afterwards, but for the most part, the fossils that we find in them, all these dead animals, that's a reminder that God judges sin. And so you see, the real message of the rock layers is repent. That's the real message. It's a reminder that God judges sin. God is gracious. He'd love to save everybody, but he's not going to save you unless you repent. He's not going to do that. Because he's righteous, he's just, and that penalty has to be paid. Again, it comes back to this. For the gospel to make sense, creation has to be true. It has to be real history. I'm not saying, nobody's claiming you have to believe in 6 days to be saved. That's not the point. We're saved by God's grace, received through faith in Christ. God doesn't require us to have perfect theology. That's not what I'm saying. But out of gratitude for salvation, we ought to get our theology as right as possible. And we ought to believe everything the Bible teaches, including the history in Genesis, because it's what makes sense of salvation. It's in Genesis we learn about the worldwide flood, that God judges sin, but also about God's mercy. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And he and his family were spared because they trusted God. And I think it's interesting too, God was the one that closed the door on the ark, the Bible says. God was the one that decided time of mercy over, time of judgment begins. And that's the same thing that we experience today. So today is the day of salvation, as I like to say. We have a number of resources on this. Again,